Okay, students, welcome back after Easter. This is the start of a little sub-topic to link a few of your last topics together in the second year with a little bit of a revision of the first year topics linked into what is going on in the world today. So I've called this little activity the New Global Economy 2020, as we are in unprecedented times, things happening in the economy that have never happened before, but just looking at it from a global point of view, as we have looked this year at how economies are interdependent and how developing and developed economies export and import from each other, and the finance flows through capital and financial accounts, goods and services and incomes flow through the current accounts. So whereas we've studied how we are linked through balance of payments and financial markets, what the current situation is showing us is how what happens in one country can significantly affect the whole global economy. So we're all locked down. There is a pandemic going on from COVID-19. What's this doing to our economy, the global economy? That's what we're going to look at. So first of all, let's follow the path down here. The economic lockdowns or the economic shutdowns at the moment. So this is creating a significant economic shock to the economy, and that is a demand side and a supply side shock. So looking at it from the macroeconomic point of view, pretty much the only thing that we are allowed to go and buy are essential goods and services. That means that usual goods and services that we buy, leisure, a lot of services just aren't able to be bought. But also the significant amount of people that can't earn at the moment, or their earnings are reduced. This is going to reduce the demand for luxury goods. You've then got things like TVs, washing machines, things that people buy regularly, consumer durables, that are going to not be sold. Things like holidays, the international travel being locked down, and then just things like cars and houses, as again those businesses are locked down. So there's going to be a significant fall in aggregate demand within the UK economy. There's also a significant supply side effect. Some of these are short-term aggregate supply effects, so things like factory shutting down in the short run, but if that was to lead into businesses going bankrupt, that would be a long-term effect. Export bans are going to affect raw materials, or stocks. Lots of countries around the world banning exports. Also, significant closure of borders, again, is going to increase costs of production. And also a lot of non-essential businesses being closed and those supplying businesses. So potentially we also have negative effects on the supply side as well as the demand side of the economy. And as we can see, and as it's predicted to happen, we're going to see a significant fall in real GDP, significant potential fall in inflation. So let's take that a little bit further and link it into what is increasingly obvious to everyone, is we're going to face some kind of recession. In terms of the tasks, and when you get to the Padlet, which is where a lot of the information will be held, this is part 1, and when you visit London you'll see the information around the economic cycle. So we've done the economic cycle as a first year topic. The last major recession that we went into was around about 2008. We kind of had some weak growth after that, but how far down we're going to go in terms of how deep is this recession but then also how long will this recession go on if this becomes a structural rather than just a cyclical thing. So thinking about our macroeconomic objectives, economic growth will be significantly impacted. Our target was 2 to 3%. Unemployment, our target's 3%, and inflation, our target's 2%. So what could happen? Some people are already forecasting a 35% fall in GDP. That would be the most severe recession we've ever seen. There's an amount of cyclical unemployment at this moment in time, so unemployment that when the economy starts again should be solved, but we don't know how much of this is going to become structural. How many jobs will be replaced by machines? How many jobs will we realise we don't need? How many jobs will we lose to other countries? And also, what will happen to the price level? Will we see a period of disinflation? So will inflation go down somewhere close to zero? Or are we looking at something on the negative side? And if it is negative, how significantly negative that is. So all of our economic indicators for this year, at least, 2020, look quite significantly negative. What will happen in 2021 and beyond, again, is things that we can hypothesize, forecast, think about what's happening in the future. For the students that are planning to go to university next year, I said this to the students in 2008 when I was teaching economics. Recessions are one of the best times to be in university. We'll come back to that unemployment in the Padlet, but being a graduate at this point in time isn't a good thing. Right? Coming out of university, starting your working lives is not good at this point. Being in university and being shielded from the impacts to an extent is probably one of the best places you could be next year. Okay, so from these negative impacts, if we come along, so what we've got here is the most obvious and the biggest thing, which was the fiscal stimulus. So lots of announcements of government spending, covering people's wages, business bailouts, and most of this has been current spending, so no significant infrastructure spending to boost the economy yet, but money to be spent on the NHS in terms of equipment and also increasing employment in some of these Nightingale hospitals, business bailouts, so subsidies through the furlough scheme, giving money to businesses to pay staff that aren't at work or aren't able to produce, but then also significant amounts of people now claiming benefits in terms of unemployment benefits, universal credit, housing benefit, and so on. So a significant amount of current spending, currently in the billions. We don't know how far that's going to go. The short-term implication for that is that this year we are going to see a significant deficit for the UK government. We were starting to reduce the national debt, but again, this as a percentage of GDP, especially if the economy starts to shrink, could be quite significant. One of the things that we look at in the Padlet as well is looking at, will a debt crisis come? So after the last recession, there was a Greek debt crisis, and as one of the most severely affected countries in the world at this moment in time, Italy, who did have a significant amount of debt, will this create a crisis again in the EU or globally? Who knows? And then the longer term question is, we haven't yet finished austerity that was started in 2010. Are we going to have an austerity budget at some point in the future? And does this mean more cuts to the public sector in the UK? Or will this current crisis increase spending on the NHS and public services as this becomes a area where people or voters want to see government spending increase. So that's kind of thinking about the fiscal stimulus. The monetary stimulus hasn't been mentioned yet, and the Bank of England hasn't really got involved in terms of rates, although they have reduced them back to 0.25. And then took them down to 0.1, which is the lowest that the UK's rates have ever been. Whether or not there will be a period of quantitative easing, depending on what happens in the economy and whether banks continue to lend. There's already questions about previous effectiveness of those policies, and also what are the costs? What are the costs in terms of potential inflation in future, and also of the impact on savers. There is a little bit linked to the stuff we did just before Easter in terms of the role of the government, and there is an article that I will save from The Guardian about this specific role, about providing money for the government. You can kind of think of it as an overdraft. So in the short term, there is no tax receipts coming into the government, or very few tax receipts, because businesses just aren't operating, consumers aren't spending, and at the same time, there may be a lack of demand for government bonds as well. So in that situation, you still have to provide this money to keep the economy going. Looking at that, and also the Bank of England being a security to these loans that are being given to businesses to try and keep them in business, and also to keep capital within banks, and the banks are lending to small businesses as well. So that's kind of the looking at the monetary and fiscal stimulus of the UK, which leads to kind of a big question of what's going to be the outcome of all of this. All of this government spending, all of this finance being put into the economy, who's going to win, who's going to lose. We don't know at this point in time, but thinking about, will this affect people who are older or younger more? Potentially the younger generation may have a significant impact from this. On different income levels, will there be redistributions of incomes up or down the income scale? In terms of industries, are some industries going to be wiped out completely? Will the cruise industry still be there in the future? Will there be inequality between rural and urban areas? Currently it seems to be that cities are more affected. Ethnicity, the black and ethnic minority communities seem to be more affected, but this could potentially be because they work in care and healthcare more often. And then lastly, different countries. So countries which have stronger healthcare systems, for example, Germany, seem to be faring a lot better. Some countries such as Spain or Italy, which may not have the same quality of public healthcare, maybe not faring as well. So lots of impacts of the coronavirus on economies, but also the response to that. So coming back through that, that's one part of the Padlet to look at, is the kind of fiscal and monetary policy responses to it. In terms of other areas that we're going to look at, it's just basic supply and demand and the price mechanism. In terms of supply side, there are short-term impacts in terms of raw material access. One thing that China did provide a lot for the world in terms of production is raw materials. So even things like the raw materials that go into paracetamol, that put a strain on the supply of paracetamol, and that ran out. Also, as staff become ill or have to isolate if they have symptoms, this creates supply issues. And also, just as people try to replenish stocks in the short term, supply becomes increasingly more inelastic. So significant shifts inwards in supply in many markets, and that in itself causing scarcity and price rises, but also the inelastic supply adding to the problem. And then demand, some products obviously increase significantly in demand, some goods and services significantly decreases in demand, so shifts inwards. Food, essential items, I'm sure you and your family have been talking about things running out at supermarkets. So it was toilet roll first, then tomatoes, then flour as everyone was trying to make bread. More importantly for the pandemic itself, lots of personal protective equipment, face masks, there's been talk of, visors, gowns, all it's significantly increasing in supply. So demand and price for those things significantly rising. And then lastly, a little bit of information failures. So demand rising or falling due to what politicians or doctors or the social media is telling people some miracle cure for coronavirus, and that in itself creating demand or supply shifts. So lots and lots of examples of the price mechanism allocating resources, but also to a large extent some of those significantly necessity resources like healthcare becoming scarce and people fighting over those things. So little bits of this week will be kind of thinking about those the winners and losers within different markets from the first year. To take that into the second year topic, so to come to kind of business economics and theory of the firm, there is one topic that we didn't go over in the second year that we'll go over a little bit, but just to kind of apply some of the things that we've looked at. So thinking about different industries within this market, thinking about businesses as profit generating businesses, and for example the cruise industry may be decimated this year, whether or not they will stay in business. Airlines of talking about needing bailouts, but also about trying to get bailouts from the government. Some industries may be changed forever because of this. One of the significant things to think about in terms of businesses and the topics that we've studied is size. So have bigger firms fared better? And that's thinking about areas such as economies of scale. Because they are bigger, were they able to have lower costs, have lower interest rates on loans? Did they have significant amounts of retained profit over time? So sitting on cash reserves that mean that they can continue to operate and pay even if they don't have customers? And are they global in that they can still operate in certain markets that aren't locked down and supply goods and services, and when certain markets do open up, they'll be able to continue? And the obvious one there is Amazon, who are significantly benefiting from spending. I think it's $10,000 a second is currently what their revenues are. So coming from that is a topic that will appear, it's not on the Padlet this week, but it will come, and that is around what's called shutdown. And in general terms, it just means a business stopping production. But what it is broken down into is short and long term. So we looked at the kind of the number one objective for all firms being profit maximising, and when times aren't going so well, survival. But survival comes in kind of three different ways. So one of them is just to shrink the business. You're still operating, you're just at a smaller size, a much smaller size. So for example, supermarkets not selling clothes but just selling essentials. In terms of a short-term shutdown, this is like the furlough scheme. So this is, you are allowing your workers to not work, you're stopping the production line, but you're hoping that when production starts again, you can just employ your workers. The last one is kind of long-term shutdown, and this is when you've gone bankrupt. You've lost all finance, or you're unable to finance, and there's already some stores such as Oasis and Debenhams saying that they have gone bankrupt and they won't be around after the shutdown closes. thing to think about in terms of that is this going to create more concentrated markets? So as firms go into business, the biggest firm just starts swallowing up market share. And when this reduces in competition, does this mean that we end up with more significant monopolies? And then the question is, do we want to intervene proactively now to prevent that? Or are we going to intervene reactively in the future to try and break up a monopoly that's formed? So that's kind of thinking about business economics. In terms of market failures, one of the parts of the Padlet, if you look at China, will show you some news stories linked to reductions in negative externalities. So as production reduces, pollution reduces, and this reduces negative externalities. However, there are some kind of opportunity costs to this about what will happen when the economy picks back up. So will we continue to produce in these ways? Will we just have had a pause and we'll start back off, and because the economy will try and pick up very quickly, we'll just negate any benefits? Will we look at trying to invest and change our production methods? However, we may lose some significant focus. There was going to be some climate talks in Glasgow at the end of the year, which have been postponed. I don't know if investment in green technology will be available if all of that money has been spent to bolster the economy in the short term. So governments might see green policies as something that they can't do in the short term to try and get the economy restarted. Okay. One last little thing to think about before this introduction is finished and I give you some directions on the Padlet, is less economically developed countries. So in the second year, we'd already looked at a few of the problems that they have. So things like low life expectancy, significant amounts of debt and national debt, lack of financial capital, poor human capital in terms of average school years, and also poor governance and public services, and linked into that, infrastructure. And at this point in time, one very significant infrastructure that's being tested in less economically developed countries is healthcare. The situation in Ecuador at the moment, in terms of news stories, and we might link that into the Padlet, shows when you don't have the money as a government, the impact that things can have on you. Through these LEDCs, the question is what solutions in the short or the long term might help these countries to not be more affected by this pandemic than other countries. One of the things that we will look at, and there'll be a little task, is around microfinance. So if finance isn't there from traditional sources, that donors in the US and the UK still provide funds to be loaned through microfinance. One thing that the IMF is already talking about is about debt relief, and either renegotiating the interest rates or writing off some of the debt within the developing world to give them the opportunity to deal with the pandemic, but also not be more significantly affected than the developed nations. So that is our mind map to talk about the topics that we're going to cover for the next few weeks. What you are going to do is go to the Padlet and start with, if you're in the first year or the second year, a review of the economic cycle. And then for this week's topics, it will be looking at national debt, and deficits, and around whether they are cyclical or structural. And there will be two tests in terms of outcome. One will be another Padlet to save some comments to, and 2 will be a quiz on the economic cycle. And also about national debts and deficits. You can just go around the Padlet, look at the news stories, see the big picture. They are all things that I think are interesting or are linked to the pandemic, things that are linked to political things that are going on as well. But just work through it, and hopefully this will give us an interesting way to share the information, and also a little bit of feedback. Is this a good way of structuring our learning going forwards?